All right, so let's dive into a region that never seems to leave the headlines.
Yeah.
The Middle East. If you're listening to this, you probably want to get a handle on like who are the powers shaping this area, especially with everything that's been happening lately, and honestly, who doesn't? It's a puzzle that's constantly changing.
Yeah. And it's really easy to just think about the Middle East as like one big thing, but that's where we can get into trouble.
Mm.
The reality is, it's this really complex mix of all these different nations. Each one has their own ambitions and agendas, and no single country has ever really managed to consistently call all the shots.
Yeah, exactly. We're actually working with a research paper for this deep dive from the European Institute of the Mediterranean. It's titled Regional Powers in a Transforming Middle East, and it's back in 2014.
Oh, wow.
I know, right? You're probably thinking 2014 isn't that kind of old news.
Yeah.
But honestly, with like the rise of ISIS and all the upheaval we've seen recently, this paper feels more relevant than ever.
Yeah, it really
Yeah.
does. And it highlights something I think is crucial. Being a regional power isn't just about like flexing your military muscles or having a ton of money. It's
Yeah.
about having the will to lead. And even more importantly, it's about being accepted by all of the other nations in the region. That's where things get really interesting.
Okay, so who are the big players in this game of regional influence? Who do we need to know about?
Well, the paper zeroes in on five heavy hitters. You've got Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, and Israel. They each have their own strengths and weaknesses when it comes to throwing their weight around, both through what we call hard power and soft power. So, like, take Egypt, for example. They've historically had a very powerful military, and they've played a central role in Arab politics. Then you've got Saudi Arabia. They wield enormous economic power, thanks to their oil reserves, of course, but also because of their position as the guardians of Islam's holiest sites.
Okay, I got it. So we've got military might, we've got economic influence. What about Turkey and Iran? They're
Yeah.
pretty big players too, right?
Absolutely. So Turkey, with its unique position, it kind of straddles Europe and Asia, right? They've been working really hard to use their growing economy to increase their influence in the region. It's a bit of a balancing act for them, though. Then there's Iran. They draw on their long history and Persian identity to project power. They use a mix of military capabilities, strategic alliances, and support for various groups across the region.
And then, of course, there's Israel,
Yeah.
a country that's always punched above its weight on the global stage.
Right. Israel's military strength is significant, plus their technological advancements and their really close relationship with the United States. All of that makes them a force to be reckoned with in the region. But here's the thing. None of these countries have managed to consistently check all the boxes when it comes to regional leadership: willingness, strength, and acceptance. It's tough to get all three at once.
Yeah. And this is where I think things get really interesting. The paper talks about how much influence external forces have on the Middle East, especially the United States. It's like having this giant elephant in the room that's constantly changing how everyone else acts.
It is a great analogy. And, if we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, it's clear that the U.S. has been playing a delicate game, trying to prevent any one regional power from becoming too dominant, even among its allies.
Oh, so it's not just about preventing any one country from becoming too strong. It's also about making sure they maintain their own influence over the whole region.
Exactly. And that strategy has had some pretty interesting consequences. The paper even talks about the debates surrounding potential U.S. disengagement under the Obama administration and how that uncertainty really sent shockwaves through the whole region. All of a sudden, these regional powers had to scramble and figure out how to adjust their strategies.
Yeah, that makes sense. But the paper also points out something I thought was fascinating. The Middle East isn't this like neatly defined region. You've got the core Arab world, sure, but then you've got major players like Iran, Israel, and Turkey, who aren't Arab states at all. Does that make things even messier?
Absolutely. It adds a whole other layer of complexity. To be accepted as a leader in any group, you need to be seen as part of that group. You need to be seen as sharing the same goals and values. That's a lot harder when you're not even part of the same cultural club, so to speak.
It's like trying to be the captain of a team when you're not even on the roster. You might have all the skills, but will anyone actually listen to you?
Exactly. And then on top of all of that, there's another curveball: the influence of non-state actors, groups like the PLO, Hamas, Hezbollah, and even Kurdish nationalist movements. They all wield a surprising amount of power. That throws yet another wrench into the works.
Whoa, so it's not just a game between countries anymore. We've got these powerful groups operating outside of the traditional system, but still making a huge impact.
Yeah, think of it as like a shadow game that's running right alongside the main event. And a perfect example of this is the recent rise of ISIS. They might not technically be a state, But their actions have had a massive impact on the power of established countries like Syria and Iraq. They carved out their own territory-challenged borders and forced all the regional powers to react in ways they never expected.
Yeah, it's almost like someone just threw a grenade into this already chaotic situation.
And it's not just ISIS, right? The paper talks about how all this competition between these major players, it creates openings for smaller countries to kind of get in on the action, to have more influence than you expect just based on their size.
Right. It's like they're using the chaos to punch above their weight.
Hmm.
Like, think about Syria after the first Gulf War. They didn't have a ton of resources, but they played this really clever diplomatic game, leveraging their alliances to gain a surprising amount of influence. Or look at Qatar in the years after the 2003 Iraq War. They used their financial clout and their media savvy to basically become a key mediator in the region, even though they're a relatively small country. It's fascinating how they managed to turn what could be seen as a disadvantage into an advantage. But all this intense competition, this constant jockeying for power, it must create a lot of instability, right?
Absolutely. And the paper highlights a key problem, the lack of strong, effective regional institutions. You need someone to act as a referee, to help manage all these competing powers and find ways to resolve conflicts peacefully.
It's like a soccer match without a ref. Things can get pretty out of hand.
Exactly. And unfortunately, the existing institutions just haven't been up to the task. The Arab League, the Gulf Cooperation Council, they're either limited in what they can do or they just haven't been effective at actually mitigating conflicts. This lack of a neutral arbiter just makes it that much harder to find any lasting solutions.
So we get this complex mix of competing powers, these external influences, these non-state actors causing chaos, and a lack of effective institutions to keep things in check. It's no wonder the Middle East is always making headlines. But I'm curious, how do we get here? Has it always been this chaotic?
Well, the paper actually takes a sort of historical approach, showing how specific events have shaped the current power dynamics. It's pretty fascinating to see how things have evolved over time.
Okay, take us back. Let's start with the aftermath of the first Gulf War in 1991. Saddam Hussein is out of Kuwait. The U.S. is the undisputed victor. What happens next?
Well, there were some attempts to establish a new Arab order. There was even this agreement called the Damascus Declaration, where Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Syria tried to find some common ground. But it didn't really pan out the way they'd hoped.
What happened? Why didn't it work?
Well, for one thing, those countries all had their own competing interests. And ultimately, instead of a new Arab order, we saw countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia becoming even more reliant on the U.S. for security.
So instead of leading to a more independent Middle East, the first Gulf War actually strengthened the U.S.'s role as the ultimate power broker.
Exactly. And then fast forward to the aftermath of the 2003 Iraq War, things get even more complicated. This is where the paper talks about the emergence of a regional Cold War.
A regional Cold War. That's an interesting way to put it. But wasn't the situation in the Middle East a lot more fluid than like a traditional Cold War? Weren't the alliances shifting constantly?
That's a great point. It wasn't as clear-cut as like the U.S. versus the Soviet Union, but there were definitely two main camps that were vying for power. On one side, you had the U.S., Israel, and their allies, mainly the GCC countries, Jordan and Egypt. They were focused on containing Iran and what they saw as the growing influence of these radical groups. Then on the other side, you had Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas. They were resisting this U.S.-led order.
And this is where sectarianism really starts to become a major dividing line, right?
Unfortunately, yes. The paper talks about how those sectarian tensions, especially between Sunni and Shia groups, they were exploited and even intensified during this period. It just added fuel to the fire of these existing conflicts and created even more instability.
So the irony is that the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which was supposed to like reshape the Middle East, actually ended up creating new fault lines and making the existing rivalries even worse.
You could say that. And in the midst of all this, you have the rise of these non-Arab powers, each trying to navigate this regional Cold War to their own advantage.
Right. We can't forget about Israel, Iran, and Turkey. They're all major players in this game. Where do they fit into this new landscape?
Well, Israel, being already closely aligned with the U.S., found themselves with some strange bedfellows in their opposition to Iran's growing influence. Meanwhile, Iran really capitalized on the chaos of the post-invasion period to strengthen its ties with key players and project its power in a more assertive way.
What about Turkey? Didn't they try to kind of play both sides, claiming good relations with everyone? Did that strategy actually work?
It's a bit more complicated than that. At first, under the AKP, Turkey really focused on soft power, promoting economic cooperation and trying to position themselves as this regional mediator. But as that regional Cold War intensified, and with the Arab Spring shaking things up even further, Turkey's position became much more precarious.
The Arab Spring, that must have thrown a huge wrench into everything. How did those uprisings in 2011 impact the balance of power in the region?
Imagine the Arab Spring as this massive earthquake, shaking the foundations of the existing order. It created both opportunities and challenges for all the regional powers. Saudi Arabia, for example, felt really threatened by the spread of these protests, and they worked really hard to contain them. They regained control in key countries like Egypt and Yemen, and they went to great lengths to prevent that unrest from spreading to their own borders. They even sent troops into Bahrain to help quell protests.
So for Saudi Arabia, it was all about damage control, protecting their own interests and trying to maintain the status quo.
Pretty much. And they were relatively successful at doing so. Iran, on the other hand, saw the Arab Spring as a chance to expand their own influence. But the results were a bit mixed. They benefited from the fall of some leaders, but they also faced pushback in places like Bahrain.
And what about Turkey? They seemed to embrace the Arab Spring initially, championing democratic reforms and supporting Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, especially in Egypt. How'd that play out for them in the long run?
Initially, there was a lot of optimism. It seemed like Turkey was really poised to become a major regional leader, promoting this new model of Islamic democracy. But as the situation in Syria deteriorated and the Muslim Brotherhood was ousted from power in Egypt, Turkey's ambitions suffered a major setback. Their support for the Muslim Brotherhood and their opposition to Assad in Syria alienated key players like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and they also found themselves at odds with Iran and Iraq over a number of issues.
So instead of riding the wave of the Arab Spring to greater regional influence, they ended up facing more isolation.
Unfortunately, yes. Their policies kind of backfired, and they struggled to find their footing in this rapidly changing landscape.
It's amazing how quickly things can change in the Middle East. You have these major events like wars and uprisings that just completely reshuffle the deck and force everyone to recalibrate.
And just when you think you're starting to understand the game, a new wild card appears. The rise of ISIS.
Yes, ISIS. Another game changer. But wasn't ISIS more of a symptom of the existing chaos than a cause? I mean, they exploited the power vacuum that was created by the Syrian civil war and the instability in Iraq.
That's true, but their emergence had a profound impact on the regional power dynamics. Think of it this way. They were this incredibly brutal force that simultaneously posed a threat to everyone and created opportunities for those who were willing to exploit the situation.
So a common enemy that could either unite rivals or drive them further apart depending on how they chose to play it?
Exactly. The U.S.-led coalition against ISIS is a perfect example. You had regional powers like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, even Iran participating. But beneath the surface, there were still all these underlying tensions and concerns about who would ultimately benefit from ISIS's defeat.
It's like everyone was trying to figure out how to use the fight against ISIS to advance their own interests.
Right. And this brings us to a crucial point. The Middle East is a region where even shared threats rarely lead to genuine cooperation. The underlying rivalries and power struggles are just too deep.
So even in the face of a common enemy, the old game of power politics continues.
Exactly. It's a constant struggle for influence, a chess match where the rules are constantly changing and the players are always looking for an advantage.
And speaking of chess matches, the paper also talks about the role of ideology in all of this. It's not just about military might and economic power, right? There's also this battle for hearts and minds.
Absolutely. Ideologies and identities are powerful tools in this regional power struggle. They're used to win support, to delegitimize rivals, and to shape the narrative of who has the right to lead. Think back to the example of Arab nationalism. It helped boost Egypt's influence under Nasser, but it hampered Saudi Arabia, which was seen as an enemy of that ideology.
So it's not just about raw power, it's also about controlling the story, about defining what it means to be a leader in the region. And how does sectarianism play into all of this? It seems like it's become an even more potent force in recent years.
It has, unfortunately. Sectarianism, especially after the 2003 Iraq War, has become a really powerful weapon. It's been used to mobilize support, demonize opponents, and justify violence. It's a double-edged sword, empowering some groups while marginalizing others, and it's only added to the complexity of the region.
Yeah, it is a complex region, but I think that's what makes it so fascinating.
Yeah.
You know, there's always something new to learn, some new development that challenges our assumptions.
That's true. And speaking of challenges, the paper concludes by saying that the Middle East is at a crossroads. You know, it feels like that's even more true today than it was back in 2014. The old order seems to be crumbling, but it's not clear what's going to replace it. Do you see any potential scenarios for how things might play out in the future?
Yeah, I mean, like, what are we looking at here?
Well, the paper doesn't make any specific predictions, but it does highlight some key trends that are worth paying attention to. One is the growing assertiveness of these regional powers. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, they're all trying to carve out a larger role for themselves on the global stage.
Right? They're not content to just be pawns in someone else's game anymore.
Exactly. They want to be the ones calling the shots. And this is leading to more competition, more friction, and potentially more conflict. Another trend to watch is the increasing importance of non-state actors. As we've seen with groups like ISIS and Hezbollah, these actors can wield enormous power and influence, often operating outside the traditional rules of international relations.
So it's not just a game between states anymore. It's a much more chaotic and unpredictable landscape.
Right, and this makes it even harder to predict the future. The old rules just don't seem to apply anymore.
So what does all this mean for the average person? Why should someone who's not a diplomat or a Middle East expert care about these power struggles?
Well, for one thing, the Middle East is a region of vital strategic importance. It's home to some of the world's largest oil reserves. It's a major transit route for global trade, and it's a key player in international security issues, like terrorism and nuclear proliferation. What happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. It affects all of us.
So whether we like it or not, we're all connected to this region in some way.
Absolutely. And understanding the dynamics of regional power is essential for anyone who wants to make sense of the broader global landscape.
It's like a giant interconnected web.
Mm,
You tug on one thread in the Middle East, and it sends ripples throughout the entire system.
that's a great way to put it.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about the key players, the external influences, the role of non-state actors, and the impact of all these historical events. It's a lot to take in, but hopefully our listeners are now feeling a bit more informed about this really complex region.
I hope so. It's a region that deserves our attention, even if it can be confusing and frustrating at times.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, it's not just about knowing who has the biggest army or the most oil. It's about understanding this really intricate interplay of factors. You've got history, religion, ideology, economics, and this constant maneuvering for power and influence.
And it's about recognizing the humanity of the people who live in this region. They're not just pawns in some geopolitical game. They have their own hopes, dreams, and aspirations.
That's a really important point. It's easy to get caught up in the abstract analysis of power dynamics and forget that there are real people whose lives are being shaped by all of these forces.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into regional powers in the Middle East. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question. Given everything we've discussed, who do you think is best positioned to emerge as like the dominant regional power in the years to come? This question with no easy answers. But I encourage you to consider all the factors we've explored today and to draw your own conclusions.
And keep in mind that the situation is constantly evolving. What seems certain today might be completely different tomorrow.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it. The Middle East is a region that keeps us on our toes, always challenging our assumptions and forcing us to think critically about the world around us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.